I have for the past, this is actually the fifth in a series. And even if you've missed any of the previous series, they're pretty well each self-contained. It's not an actual series. They're looking at different aspects. I've had 5 of these presentations, and this is the 5th. And the other ones are all up online on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and also posted on the BYU Family History Library website, which is on the Brigham Young University Harold B. Lee Library website. So you can find all of these previous ones, and they're all ready to be reviewed. In this particular one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the same principles that I've talked about previously, but I'm going to elucidate a little more about what happens after you actually find some information about the next generation, and if that's valid, or what's happening there. So we'll move right along. Just kind of to start, once you solve the brick wall, don't you just have another brick wall? In other words, if you go back one more generation and you found you've spent all this time trying to find those records, doesn't that just put you back in the same spot that you were when you started? Well, yeah, sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's not necessarily the case. You really have a lot of options that occurs, and the answer to that is partially how you keep track or where you store your information. So for example, if you are having your if all your information and all your research has been put on a desktop program, I'm not going to name any programs, but a program that is not connected directly to the internet, then you will be at another dead end, because then you'll have to start doing more research. Well, the advantage of having your doing your research, whether you keep your research on your desktop or whether you enter it later online, but the advantage of putting it online is that when you reach the next level of your brick wall, you may just tap into a whole well-researched family. In other words, you may have found the link between this individual and a lot of other research that has been done. And so this is probably, from my perspective, one of the major reasons why I would suggest that you would want to have your family tree online. Now, it doesn't help to put your family tree online if you have your own private family tree online. So if you put it on a website that allows you complete control and you don't have anyone else looking at your family tree, you still haven't given yourself any of that advantage, except you may receive record hints or record matches from the website. But the key on this, how this whole thing works, is to put your family tree in the collaborative, collective, universal family tree that is on Family Search. That's a free family tree. Now, okay, so now we get into the same reactions and questions and concerns that arise constantly, and that is, what about changes? What about all this? What about everybody coming in and wiping it out and all those things? Well, yeah, they can all happen. And I would suggest from that standpoint that you keep a backup copy of all your data on a separate program. If that's a concern to you, copy out your data onto another website, and where you have control over your family tree. Some of the simplest ways to do that are to use a program like Ancestry or MyHeritage, and just put all your information into Ancestry and MyHeritage. The problem in doing that, of course, is that you end up duplicating the time and your effort, because it takes just as much time to enter your entries over into the other websites as it does Those people who have access to the Family Search Partner programs, who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have some shortcuts. You have connections between Family Search and Ancestry, and you have connections between MyHeritage and Family Search. So those kinds of things are factors that you have to weigh in with when you decide how you're going to preserve the information. The other part of that question is what happens to your information when you die. Inevitably, all of us will pass on, and we will have to turn our data over to whoever is left in our family who has any interest and wants to do anything with it. Okay, so maybe that's good, maybe that's not so good. So most of the people that I talk to, they say, well, if my family ever got a hold of it, they just throw it away. So that's kind of the concern that we have. And that is another very good reason for putting the data up on the Family Search family tree, because there's a fairly, as much effort and as much care as can be taken to preserve the family tree will be taken. That is an assurance. And so we are fairly confident that it will outlast any of us. The next step is the good thing. The good thing about genealogy is that you're never done. You're never finished. You can never say, oh, I've got it all complete. Although there are people who think that. That's myth. That's fabrication. That doesn't have anything to do with reality. Reality is that you're fighting against the numbers here. The numbers are exponential: 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 512, etc. on up. And that is the total number of your ancestors' doubles in each generation. The number of their descendants depends on a lot of different factors, but it increases even greater by each generation, because one pair of grandparents might have anywhere from 1 to maybe 15 children or more, depending. And so you can have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of relatives. And the chances that you as an individual would ever work your way through that pile is probably gets close to impossible. And so unless you happen to be from someplace where you have only found 3 people and that's it, and you've never found anyone else, then you've got a different situation. That doesn't mean those ancestors aren't still out there, but there may not be an ability to make that connection. In that case, it's a good idea to go out and get DNA tests. And I don't mean, when I use the word test, I said plural tests. It's a good idea to go out and get at least 2 or more DNA tests on different websites and put your family tree, as much of information as you have, on that website. And so you can get the benefit of them matching your DNA description to other users of their particular programs. And this is a very good way to get around the I don't have any relatives issue. So there's always another puzzle to solve. No matter how far we go and what we do, we never run out of challenges. And as I've said many times, if genealogy wasn't as hard as anything that I can imagine, I wouldn't be interested in it. It was why I'm attracted to it is it takes so many different skills, and it also involves a great deal of work to get a very satisfactory return, and it's always a challenge. And there's never a new day when there isn't new questions that are just as perplexing as the ones from the days before. So here we have a real interesting puzzle. I went out to where there was a end of line, apparent end of line on here, and this is William Parkinson and Susanna Dexter's family as it appeared at the time that I did this slide. And in this case, as I progressively made the changes, the slide changes, and so all of this information that's here now is no longer available on the family tree because it's all been corrected. So we're just going to have to look a little bit about this. So why is this such an interesting puzzle? Some of you who are looking at this particular slide probably figured out pretty quickly that there are some really serious problems with the children in this family. And it may be some problems with the parents that we don't know yet. So let's kind of look at this and focus in here on first on Susanna Dexter. And she was born in 1744 and died in 1775. At least those are the figures that we have in the Family Search family tree. So the question is, are they reliable? Are they correct? But just for the purposes of this particular presentation, I'm going to say, yeah, these are the dates, and we're not going to take a great deal of time to try to prove one way or the other that they're right or wrong. But we need to look down here at least the last two children. And the obvious thing that we're looking at here is that Susanna Dexter died in 1775. And James Dexter, who is supposedly a child, was born in 1787. Probably not. And the other one was 1781. William Parkinson, 1781. Now, someone could have been born in 1773 or 1772, but we'll come to that and see what that gets us. So if our goal is to add a father and a mother to Susanna Dexter, we don't want to start out on a kind of a shaky foundation here. We don't want to be in the situation where what we're trying to accomplish is not really based on any kind of valid, substantiated research that has cited sources that can tell us whether someone got this information from a record that we would rely on, or whether they just made the whole thing up and added in a name and made up a date. Well, if they did, they were ingenuous, because you added in a date after the person was dead, and that probably isn't going to go anywhere. So here we are with Susanna Dexter and James Dexter. Why would his name be Dexter if she was Dexter and married to Parkinson? I don't know, but I mean, you can begin to see that there's a number of problems with this. So then let's go to the next slide. And we've got the same thing here, but let's first look at William Parkinson, the father, and just get a kind of an idea of what we're talking about. Now, all of this that I'm talking about doesn't seem to have anything to do with finding Susanna Dexter's parents. And you're saying, well, what we want to do is go find the parents. So let's go look for the parents. The answer is no. Let's make sure that we're actually looking for, if we want, let's start out with the premise, let's make sure we're actually related to this person. Am I actually related to Susanna Dexter and this William Parkinson? And the question is maybe, maybe not. So let's look at William Parkinson, because before I go jumping out here to place the next generation out, I want to make sure I have this generation pretty well substantiated. So I go look here at William Parkinson, and I see on Family Search right now, there are no record hands. There are 4 sources cited, and we see that he was born in Upwood with Great Raveley, Huntingdonshire, England. That really is the name of the place. And he was christened there, and he died there, and he was buried there. Okay, so this is 1744 to 1782, and that is not unusual. The general rule being at this point, and it's been substantiated by big studies if you want to talk to me about it some other time, and that is that people were born and they were christened and married and died within 6 miles of their birthplace. And if you extended that out to about 10 miles, you'd be pretty well, you'd started getting into a questionable zone, but you'd still be pretty well in the range. And so what we need to look here is for consistency. And if we look for consistency, we're going to find, see what's really going on here. So now we look at the sources. And what are we looking for in a source? What we're looking for in a source is a record which tells us if there was a parent-child relationship between William Parkinson and any of his children, his supposed children, and even of his parents. So we would need to go through all of these 4. Fortunately, there's not like 50, but if there were 50, we probably wouldn't be doubting that this was the right person, because there'd probably be enough information there to let us know who he was. But with 4 sources, we can go look. And basically, I'm not going to go through the whole source process, but what I am going to do is tell you that none of these sources have any information that help substantiate who William Parkinson's father was, nor do they have any information that says who any of his children were. So basically, they're all these kinds of records. Willm, W-I-L-L-M, which we read as William Parkinson, marriage 30 May 1768 in Huntingdonshire, England, and Sus Dexter. Okay, so even if we assume the names are correct, William and Susan, and not Susanna or some other iteration of Susan, or something, some other, not too many different things that could come out of William. But Huntingdonshire, England is a county. And first of all, we have no way of knowing if this person has anything to do with the place where the children were born. So even if we did come up with baptismal christening records for each of the children that were shown, we would still have a question in our mind, because Huntingdonshire is the county. It's the whole area. There are dozens upon dozens of parishes in Huntingdonshire. By the way, Huntingdonshire's name was changed in England. They back in the 1970s, they consolidated a lot of the counties and renamed them, and so it's really Cambridgeshire now. And so it's not really, it's even more complicated than it looks. Okay, so now we're back to this, and we have a marriage in Upwood with Great Raveley, and we have the children. So let's look at the son that's named James Dexter. He's the most obvious one that we encounter here as to anything that's going on, with this particular family. So let's look at James Dexter. And it says that he was christened on the 13th of May, 1787. Well, that could mean a number of different things. Okay. The obvious question still is, why is his name Dexter if his mother's name? And it says that his mother's name was S. Dexter, and that could be Sarah, Sally, Susan, Shana, no, all the English names that start with S. So all the female names that start with S. So we really don't have any question, any way that we're actually connecting this. But if we start to analyze any any genealogical records, we need to understand the basis for how the whole system works. How does genealogy work? And the underlying basic fundamental, I can't even get into enough different words that described how important this is the location. The location is historically the place where an event occurred that had genealogical significance and was recorded by someone who was there at the time or had a duty to report the event. Okay, so that's the technical definition. But without the location being reasonable, there is no reason to even consider the rest of the information. Even if there were a remote possibility that James Dexter was christened. And here's the catch with christening. You automatically you think, well, he was christened after his mother died. And the answer is that isn't the issue, because christening is something that can be performed even in an adult. A person could have been christened for the first time 30 more 40 50 60 whatever years after they were born. And it's not unusual to find whole families, 6 children I have run into it, where all the children were christened on the same date, and that date had nothing to do with any of their birth dates. And some of them were quite old at the time. And I also have people who go to get married in the Church of England and in the Catholic Church who, upon trying to present themselves for marriage, are unable to prove that they were ever baptized. And so they are rebaptized or baptized for the first time when about time they're getting married. So we can't assume by simply looking at this record that a christening date that appears to be after the mother's death date has something fundamentally wrong with it. Does that make sense? Yes. So what else? Well, we really have an issue because what we've got here is Heddon on the Wall, Northumberland, England, United Kingdom. Okay, now I'm going to ask just you all and all of you who are here, as you're visualizing this, can you visualize the map of England and tell me how far it is from Huntingdonshire to Northumberland? They're 2 different counties. And so how far is it? Well, most of the people in the United States, I can guess, would probably not have that kind of information readily available in their head. And so the answer to that is we go to maps and we look at maps. The difference is, of course, if I ask the same group of Americans from the United States, people from the United States, if a person was born in California and another person was born in New York state, would they, how would that be a big distance? Would that be a long ways? And a lot of people would probably say, yeah, it's about 3,000 miles across the United States, because that's sort of a common knowledge thing. Well, once you have done enough English research, you may begin to understand where all the counties are. That's probably not going to happen unless you happen to have some kind of really interesting family where they were born and somebody was born in each one of the counties in England. But looking at maps is absolutely important. So we got to look at the date, and then we've got to look at the location. So Susanna was born in Raveley in Huntingdonshire in 1775. And so she's in Upwood with Great Raveley in Huntingdonshire, England. And then we have another place that we're going to look at, and that's Heddon on the Wall, Northumberland, England, United Kingdom. Okay, so when we get to the point here, if we look again at the dates and locations and look more than once, we see that there's only one record here for James Dexter, and it's definitely got him placed in Northumberland. So it's not a question of maybe, there's just something wrong, or there may be some kind of other record. So we have to go with that one record and look between Huntingdonshire and Northumberland, because there is only one source. So now if we plot that out on Google Maps, and that's the simplest way to do all this, is to go to Google Maps and put in the first place and then get directions to the second place. It will roughly give you the distance and the time it takes in a car or walking or anything else. And if you're in the 1700s, you better click on walking and see how long it takes. And then your question is going to be, did the mother walk from Upwood all the way up to Hendon-on-Wall to have one of her child under the name of her maiden name, and then walked back to Upwood to have the rest of the children? So the ancestor traveled over 200 miles to have a baby when she was already dead. Oh, we forgot about the fact that she was already dead. But we're assuming that at this point, we're going to assume the christening date was close to the birth date. And so even if that was the case, it would make it even. So even if we give, sort of a liberal factor to the christening date, we still have the problem of the distance, because back in 1787, it would take a considerable period of time for anyone to travel by foot, by cart, or by horse between Hedden and Upwood, and not likely. So where do we get from here? What we get is the first rule of genealogy, and that is when the baby was born, the mother was there. So if that baby was born in Hendon-on-Wall, some mother was there. And so it can't be, very, very, very unlikely to be the mother we found down in Upwood. In fact, probably not at all. There's just no way you can make that claim and that connection based on S and the name. So that child is still out there, let's say, but probably in some other family in that part. So what do we do with this once we've found this information and we've come to these conclusions with in Family Search? Well, this is why the program's good, because you can go in and make those corrections. You don't have to live with it. You can actually correct it. Now, this gets kind of into the issue of the changes that are made to the program. Yeah, okay, so here comes some changes. Well, you say these are good changes, but the other changes are all bad changes. The answer is that over the years that I've been working on Family Search, I've seen vastly more good changes than I have bad changes. So even though bad changes are like pesky mosquitoes or weeds in your garden, they do not determine your overall experience of working with Family Search. If you focus on just the changes, then you may never get past that. But if you focus on all the good stuff there is, and all the information and all the photos and everything else, then you'll begin to appreciate the program. So we start editing the entries in the family tree and detach this child from, and give an explanation about the location and our analysis of it. And we detach that person from the program. Now, that doesn't mean that they're erased. You can't delete that person. So ultimately, if that person if someone finds that person and adds them into the correct family, then that will take place. But it just leaves them out there as an individual floating out in space, and so they can get captured anytime. They may get captured by a record hint or something else and put in with the family. So that isn't a major issue, and because we don't have any information, we're certainly justified in detaching that individual. So now we need to make sure all the information you already have is supported by the sources and accurate as possible. So now that was just one example, but we need to go through that process with everybody in that area. Now, let's get back to the kind of the purpose of going through this process. The idea here is we want to jump one more generation back and go through or break through a brick wall. But after you've broken through the brick walls, and when you're looking at the family tree and doing what you do, this is what you do. You go through and start verifying and adding in additional information and substantiating all of the information that is contained in the tree. And by doing that, you add more people, you add more sources, you add more, make the whole tree more reliable, and you are able to begin to work on additional brick wall, additional end of line people. So one way to start out with these people is to put all of the information into on a map. So taking minus the one Northumberland person, we will put the rest of them on the map, and the three remaining children were born in Ramsey, Great Reveille, and not in Upwood. And does that make a difference? And how far is it? Well, it's still within the 6-mile limit. So there is a possibility that these people could be, and they're actually in a 5-mile circle, so not even 6, but they happen to all come out within 5 miles. So from a reasonable standpoint, the remaining children could be part of that family. So we need to look and see what kind of records are available and where those records came from and what kinds of records I might find to verify, add more information, and decide if we can find out. Now we actually are adding information. And as we add this information and as we do the research, then we will begin the process of building a foundation that will eventually connect these people to the next generation. So it's a process of incrementally adding information to all of the people who are present, meaning the entire family, all the children and all the spouses reciprocally, all the women's with their husbands and all the husbands with their wives. So all of that information added goes into determining, once we've done that, we have the area to look at. So then that gives us a rather smaller area, you might say, to focus on when we start looking to go out and look for records for the next generation. But you'll notice that I haven't at this point mentioned anything about doing research on any of the parents of the people who are missing, the parents who are missing. That's because we're not there yet, and we're not going to get there until we have really determined that this information is accurate and correct. Okay, so now we need to check to see whether these children are connected to this couple with cited sources. So we have all Parkinson guys, and one of them's even named William. They're all born within the time period that looks like doesn't give us any questions about whether or not they were christened at a very much later date. By the way, just as kind of an explanatory, if you're not familiar with English records, is that we don't have birth records back here. There just isn't anything with birth record on it. It would be extraordinarily rare to find a parish record that told the birth date. more likely it would be, you would find the christening date, which is the baptism date. Traditionally happens within a few days after the birth. There are times when it actually occurs on the date of the birth, but that's if the baby is passing away and they perform the baptism for kind of an emergency baptism. But if the child lives, they will probably rebaptize. So there might be two different parish registers, one on the date of the birth and one on the date that they take the baby down to the church to get baptized. So now they've we would assume that some of these records now. At this point, William Parkinson is a question because we don't have any kind of a birth date for him. That's the William Parkinson down at the bottom there. And then we have two others. One is 773 and deceased, and one is 772 and 846. So here's the question: is which one of these is my ancestor? Well, my ancestor happens to be Charles Parkinson, the first one listed right there, who was born in 1772 and died in 1846. So that, that's the, in other words, that's the other two would be collateral relatives. And even if we lost those two relatives for some reason, the crucial thing for making the line is that I have to have a parent-child relationship demonstrated between Charles Parkinson and William Parkinson and Susanna Dexter. Okay, so what that means is that we are basically looking along that one line, and then if we know that is correct, we can fill it in with additional information that may help us find Susanna Dexter's parents. So that's how this all kind of ties together. Guess what? Charles Parkinson, the direct line ancestor, has no sources showing who his parents were. He has 9 sources out there in 1772, and none of those are sources that show his parents. And I could go through and show you each one and illustrate what I mean. In other words, a marriage record without naming the parents, a christening record without naming the parents. The census records obviously do not name his parents. Death records don't name his parents. All of these different records that are here, primarily death records, a marriage record, and burial records, and whole voting records, and there's only maybe one that could even begin to show the parents, but that, and neither do the other children. In other words, none of the 3 children in this particular family have any records showing that they are actually the children of William Parkinson and Sarah. And so let's go back. And I mean Susanna, sorry. I've got Sarah Parkinson's in my head. Okay, so what that means is that I really am not related to these people at all, and any effort that I would have expended without having gone through this analysis and this research would have been beneficial to somebody, but not to me and not to my line. Okay, so how long would this really take? Well, it would take as long as it takes. It could take just a few minutes. And matter of fact, to go through the sources, which would be one of the very first steps, and determine that we had no line connection between Charles Parkinson and his parents, would be the simplest way to determine. But he would be one of the children. So you would have to remember to go look at all the children to see and make sure you were looking for all the children, and particularly the one that is your direct line ancestor along your ancestral line. your blood relative, if you want to call it that. And so we can see here that Ramsey and Upwood may not be close enough, because they may not really have, they may have had other Parkinson family living there. Now they could be related back in time. That's very possible, but not necessarily, because Parkinson is not an uncommon name in England. And the fact that two people share the same surname does not mean that there's no bearing on whether they're related or not related. Different surnames do not mean that the people aren't related, and the same surname does not indicate that the people are related. Surnames have nothing at all, hardly. They're helpful when you start looking, because they give you part of the way of identifying an individual if they happen to have a surname. So the apparent brick wall moves forward in time a generation. And that means that we need to find out if there is a birth record for Charles Parkinson. And so far, we need to look out and see where they got the christening date from, 12 May 1772. And you might note over there that the birth date and the christening date are the same. And I would automatically, in this case, simply take out the birth date, because unless the christening record has some information substantiating the birth date, that birth date doesn't make any sense at all. That's not the day that the christening did not occur on the date of birth. That mother did not get up from having a baby and rush down to the cathedral to have her baby christened. Maybe it's possible it happened, but we're not very likely, and particularly where there's no record that actually mentions the birth date. Okay, so there's 3 people watching him and 12 past contributors. That means that when you're watching someone, it's now called following instead of watching. So there are 3 people following this person, and there's 12 past contributors. That's the total number of people. There's a couple of records here that substantiate his date of birth of 12 May 1772, both of which do not have birth dates, but those are the sources that have been tagged to that particular date. That's probably the date. The christening date is probably correct, but the birth date probably is not. And the 2 sources that are there don't have specific date, neither one of those. Those are census records and a burial record. They're both just years for when that baby was birthed. Okay, and this is the problem with them being the same. So now, this is my new end of line person. Well, it has been all along. And now we're ready to start over with a new challenge that we may have thought was resolved. We may have believed all of that stuff that was in there. And now that we've gone through and examined it, we've identified the actual end of line person. And that's Charles Parkinson and Hepzibah Newton. And they're, I'm going to have to say, fairly well documented, except for their parents. And now this is what it looks like. So after we've gone through all this and we've moving on and moved them on to their possible parents, wherever they may be, now this is the end of the line. So now, instead of looking for parents for Susanna Dexter, we're looking for Charles Parkinson and Hepzibah Newton. And so far in the family tree, neither of those parents have been identified. And it's not surprising when you get back into the 1700s, because that starts to be when people when the records run out for a lot of people. So this is what happened after we did all that research and all of those checkings back and forth. And so Parkinson, Charles Parkinson, has no sources showing the names, and he's the real brick wall, not Susanna Dexter, who wasn't related, apparently related to any of the children that were listed. So what's the lesson here? The lesson here starts out is that we carefully review all of the attached sources to a person. What if there are no sources? Then there is no person. It doesn't matter if there's a name and a date and a place. There is still no person, because there is nothing that attaches that to an historical record and gives some way that we can rely upon that person existed. And we have to make sure the dates are consistent. That was the other problem. We had children who were apparently christened outside of the death date of the mother, and the common would be that would be impossible because they were not, because they couldn't be born when the mother was already dead. Look at the places on Google Maps and show the distances. Yes, we need to do that for every place on until you get just sort of exhaustively inundated with ideas and able to figure out the distances between two places in your head. It is best to go in and do this on a Google map every time. I do this for anytime anybody asks me where to start doing, to ask a question about anybody in anything, any place in the world, I will always go look at the map and find out what the place is, where it is, and whether it's a real place. I look specifically for records that show the identity of the parents. To move back a generation, you have to have a document that shows a parent-child relationship. That's the only basis by which you can put a parent in. Now, when you say a document, oral histories or information that you received from a relative, all of those are documents. All of those are sources. Those are valid. We put them in. That doesn't mean that they're not subject to change. In fact, if it was on a parish register, it would not mean it wasn't subject to change, because it could have been wrong. The priest may have entered the wrong date or even the wrong name. So make sure that the target person really is the brick wall. That's kind of the whole story here. And always look for a source supporting a parent-child relationship. So these are all of the kind of factors that go into working through this kind of a problem. And of course, we now have to start all over again with Charles Parkinson. Did we lose 2 generations? No, there was really no loss, because we never had them. They didn't really exist. They were not there. They weren't correct. They weren't substantiated by some historical or external factual basis. And this critical analysis of the data is the same critical analysis that you should be living with every day of your life. This is nothing new. This is the way you should be approaching anything that goes on around you, as to verifying to your own personal satisfaction that it's correct. If you don't do that, if you just accept whatever is thrown at you, then you'll probably end up being very frustrated with the family search family tree. Remember, there are a number of reasons why information may be difficult to be found. You might be looking in the wrong place. You might not have done enough research about the person's children. The person could have changed his or her name. A woman may have married the married name of a previous marriage. There's all sorts of iterations of things that can happen. You may be looking at in the wrong place, and there may not be any records for the time and or place the person lived. And if there are, they're not available to you. and you can't find them. So that may be the case, although that is the lifelong search of the genealogist, is to find those elusive records. The person named in your records may not actually exist. That's, if far enough back, you're going to find that's probably the case in a lot of cases. So if you think you're going back into the Dark Ages and Middle England and back in the Middle Ages, and you're just getting names off of a book somebody wrote, they may not actually be real people. So what's missing from my example? All of the things that I've talked about so far. What is the one thing that's missing? All the research it takes to find the sources. It actually takes work, and it actually takes time. And it is part of what is good and attractive about genealogy, that you really can dig in and find this kind of information and develop all of these different lines. So the key here is to keep working, keep looking, and you'll find a lot of information, and you may very well make it through and find information that that helps you. In the case of these Huntingdonshire folks and or that lived in Ravelry, it may take going to England and looking in the registers, because what we have is sometimes not complete, and what's there may have more records. So those are the kinds of things that may end up. Thanks for watching.